Okay, welcome everyone to a new episode of Myth Bust Monday. This week we're going to be looking at the so-called mind-muscle connection. So this idea that you should intentionally focus on squeezing and isolating the muscle that you're trying to target when doing weight training exercises. This topic caught my attention from a recent issue of the Mass Research Review, where Greg Nuckols reviewed a new study on this topic. So we're going to use that as the sort of backbone for this video. Now, historically, there have been two sides to this debate. On the one hand, you've got bodybuilders who have been arguing for decades that it's really important to really focus on isolating the muscle you're working because you'll be able to activate it better and force it to grow as a result. And then more recently, on the other hand, you have more academic types arguing that, well, the mind-muscle connection doesn't really matter all that much because as long as you're taking the weight through a full range of motion, the muscles are gonna have to be firing anyway in order to get the weight up. So according to them, what you should instead think about is how you're moving your body in 3D space and how you're executing the movement properly. And you don't need to worry too much about activating specific muscles since they're going to be active if you move the weight regardless. Now up to this point, I think that as a whole, the scientific data has been somewhat in favor of not using internal cueing, or what we would call a mind-muscle connection, and instead using external cueing, so just focusing on proper execution and just moving the weight. And as shown in this 15-year review of attentional focus, when it comes to things like stability, balance, endurance, and even force production in sport-specific contexts, as you can see here, external focus beats internal focus pretty much across the board. But still, up until now, while there has been a good deal of research measuring acute variables like EMG activation and performance, and I discussed one of those studies in a previous video, which I'll link below, up until now, there hasn't been a single long-term training study looking at whether an internal or external focus would result in better muscle size and strength gains. So enter this 2018 study out of Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's lab, and quickly just covering the methods here. They took 27 untrained college-aged men and randomly assigned them to either an internal focus group, so they were told to squeeze the muscle, or an external focus group where they were told to focus on getting the weight up. They trained for 8 weeks, doing 4 sets of 8 to 12 reps on the standing barbell curl and leg extension only, and all sets were taken to concentric failure, and they used progressive overload each week, adding weight when possible. And after the 8 weeks, they measured hypertrophy of the biceps and the quads, and they found that there was significantly more biceps hypertrophy in the internal focus, or the mind-muscle connection group, but there was no difference in quad growth between the two groups. And as you can see here in the graph from the Mass Research Review, the results were pretty impressive. Over 5% more growth over just 8 weeks by simply focusing on squeezing your biceps. But then I think the question becomes, why does the mind-muscle connection only seem to work for the biceps and not for the quads? Well, the authors of this paper suggest that it could be because people seem to simply have better control of and coordination with their upper extremities compared with their lower extremities. And I think this does make some intuitive sense. Your upper limbs are often better at performing fine motor tasks that require more precision, and your lower limbs usually aren't as good. They also bring up that perhaps this is something that could be trained over time. For example, I remember seeing a video of an ambidextrous Chinese woman writing with her left and right hands and the left and right feet simultaneously. So despite the fact that most of us aren't as finely coordinated with our lower bodies, I'm pretty confident that experienced bodybuilders are able to harvest and summon this mind-muscle connection in the lower limbs over time. And I have a feeling that if they did use more highly trained and experienced subjects in this study, perhaps we would have seen better results for quad hypertrophy as well. Now, they also measured strength gains in this study, and they did that through isometric testing, so basically measuring how much force you can exert against an immovable load, and they didn't find any statistically significant differences between the groups. So at this point, on the whole, it really seems that since there isn't any difference in strength, but there is better muscle gain with the internal focus approach, this really seems like an obvious win for the bros and for the mind-muscle connection. But before we make any firm conclusions, I'd like to just quickly point out a few limitations with this study. First, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're only looking at single joint isolation exercises in a moderate rep range here. So I don't think that these results should be too loosely extrapolated to other heavier compound exercises like squats, presses, in deadlifts. And in fact, based on previous research, I would expect that if compound exercises had been used, the external focus group, so just focusing on getting the weight up, would probably have seen better strength gains than the internal focus group. Also, as I mentioned, strength outcomes were measured using an isometric strength test, which may not capture what is supposed to be the main benefit of using an external focus, which is to improve motor performance. When you think about it, if you're just pushing against some immovable object, you aren't really testing your true motor performance and its relation to strength. But still, motor learning and performance is generally not a big player when it comes to these single joint movements anyway. So in the context of this study and what they measured, I think it still makes sense to use it. So in all, I think that in combination with previous EMG research, which I've discussed here on the channel before, we really are starting to develop a solid evidence base for the mind-muscle connection. And in light of this new data, I would say the idea that the mind-muscle connection leads to greater size gains is not busted. Pulling all of this together, my recommendation would be to use external cueing, so just focus on how your body's moving in space for heavy compound exercises like squats, deadlifts, and presses, especially when going heavy on those. So say anything below 8 reps. And I would reserve the mind-muscle connection approach mainly for isolation exercises where the goal is going to be to target a specific muscle. So things like bicep curls, cable flies, and I would even include leg extensions and leg curls despite the findings in this study. I also find that some compound exercises like hip thrusts and Romanian deadlifts can benefit from using a mind-muscle connection, since people often have a hard time activating their glutes or hamstrings in those movements. And if you were to just focus on externally cueing and just simply getting the weight up, your lower back or your quads may start to take over. So anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing more research on this topic, but as it stands now, it seems that there really is some truth to what the bros have been saying all along. So that's going to be it for this one, guys. We've talked a lot about the importance of a mind-muscle connection in this video.
每周不间断的专业健身知识，收费健身魂。